wasn't for Noam, when I was 18 years old, I worked at a activist bookstore in Davis Square, and I bought a tape, back in the day, tapes. But I bought a tape, I think it was $4, of Noam Chomsky giving a talk. I bought a second one of Howard Zinn, and it opened my mind. I can honestly say that that was the trigger for me to become an activist. So I don't want to be too long-winded, but would like to introduce Noam. Thank you for coming, Noam.
Like it or not, we happen to be living at the most important moment in human history. It's a moment when the human species is going to make a critical decision whether to live or die. Not literally disappear, of course, but the remnants that will remain will have few prospects of decent life. We've already made that decision for a huge number of our fellow creatures. Species destruction now is, as you may know, at the level of about 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth, ended the age of the mammals, of the dinosaurs, opened the way for some small mammals to survive, ultimately leading to us, and we're now reliving the experience of the asteroid, unfortunately for the rest of the world. And we're next if we proceed on our current course. And in fact, it may not be long. We're talking about generations, not centuries. As you probably know, there's a famous Doomsday Clock, which is run by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists ever since the dawn of the atomic age, 1947. Every year, a large group of distinguished specialist experts try to estimate how far humans are from total extermination. That would be midnight. Clock moves up and back towards midnight. Last year, it moved 2 minutes. It's every January. Last January, it moved 2 minutes closer to midnight, up to 3 minutes before midnight, closest it had been for about 30 years. This year, just a couple days ago, the clock was set again for 3 minutes to midnight. Midnight means termination. There was an accompanying statement. It referred to the two huge problems that we have to either do something about quickly or say goodbye to each other. One is nuclear weapons. The other is destruction of the environment. The statement did say that there had been some small steps forward, but not enough to justify moving the hands. On the nuclear front, they said that the deal with Iran is a slight advance in reducing international tensions and the threat of major war. The United States is constantly threatening war against Iran and has in fact been carrying out war against Iran. We proudly describe our cyber war, which carries out sabotage and destruction in Iran. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an act of war which justifies military action in response. NATO recently agreed that the mutual defense element of the NATO treaty, it will be invoked by cyber war. If any country is attacked by cyber war, all of them have the right to respond by military force. We, of course, arrogate that right to ourselves. So that was a small step forward, which may not survive the next election. Every Republican candidate wants to remove it. They only compete in how rapidly they'll do so. But that was a small step forward. On the environmental issue, there was, again, a small step forward. There was they refer to the Paris conference last month, which reached some kinds of agreements, by no means sufficient, but some agreements. They point out that it doesn't mean much unless it becomes a binding treaty. It was just voluntary agreements. The press, like the New York Times, Washington Post, explained clearly why it couldn't be a binding treaty. It's because of the United States. The Republican Congress will simply not accept the treaty, and in fact promises to reverse everything that has been done. That's, again, next November. Means for these reasons alone, and there are many others, there's some pretty awesome decisions that are going to be made within the next couple of months in the United States. And you see it every day if you read the paper. So this morning, for example, the New York Times has an article on an energy bill. They're optimistic. They say it might get bipartisan support, which is very rare. Here's what it says. In order to achieve a bipartisan consensus, Ms. Murkowski and Ms. Cantwell, Republican and Democrat, had to significantly scale down the scope of the bill. It does not include language to drastically increase fossil fuel production, as most Republicans would like, nor does it boldly address climate change, as most Democrats want. That is a stark choice in November for this reason alone. The same article offers some good news as they present it. Since the passage of the last major energy law in 2007, the United States has gone from fears of oil and gas shortages to becoming the world's leading producer of both fuels. So that's the upbeat part, which is simply collective insanity. No further comment needed. And very common. Almost every comment on discussion of this topic talks about it. We've reached 100 years of energy independence. We're overflowing with gas and oil. The only problem with the glut is that the energy corporations aren't making enough profit, but other than that, it's fine. Every day in the science journals, you read new evidence about how grim the prospects are. So a couple of weeks ago, it was discovered that a huge iceberg in Greenland, huge iceberg, which it was thought had been anchored to the ground so it wouldn't melt too quickly, has in fact broken free and is now melting much faster than it was assumed. It will significantly raise sea levels. Another recent study discovered that the rate of climate change today is 100 times as fast as at any period in geological history that be recorded. By other estimates, it's 1,000 times as fast. It's and it goes on like that. There another report in the current issue of the MIT Technical Journal estimates that here at our latitude, average climate change amounts to moving south 10 meters every day and increasing. It's already a very likely factor in major disasters that are taking place. The Darfur crisis was a large major factor in it, was desertification, large-scale desertification, which is probably a result of climate change, which drove nomadic tribes into agricultural areas, set up serious conflicts leading to the horrors that you know about. The war in Syria was preceded by several years of the worst drought in history in that region, which goes back thousands of years, destroyed the agricultural economy, drove huge numbers of people into the cities, set up the basis for which could be sparked by it. The crisis then took place. Now the country is destroying itself. If you turn to, say, South Asia, rise in the sea level will wipe out large parts of Bangladesh. melting of the Himalayan glaciers, which is going on, will eliminate the water supply for South Asia. That'll mean a couple of billion people starving, dying, trying to go somewhere. If you think that the refugee crisis is serious now, we haven't seen anything. And in fact, right now, the United Nations just yesterday came out with the estimate of the number of people driven from their homes in the world. It's by far the highest on record. It's almost 1 in 100 fleeing from their homes and increasing. Well, that's climate change. The Doomsday Clock was set up originally in 1947 because of the concern over nuclear war, and that's another issue today too. So the statement that accompanies the setting of the Doomsday Clock a couple of days ago discusses, quote, highlighted tensions between the United States and Russia, continued conflict in Ukraine and Syria, tensions over the South China Sea, Russian and American nuclear weapons modernization programs. For the United States, Obama's program is about $1 trillion in coming years of modernization. Those who like arcane facts may recall that we have a legal obligation under the non-proliferation. Strategic analysts on all sides understand that what's called missile defense is in fact a first strike weapon. If it ever works, which is questionable, it would be it could not conceivably stop a first strike, but it's imaginable that it could stop a retaliatory strike, which makes it a first strike weapon. So when we place missile defense on the borders of Russia, they understand that it's providing the foundation for a first strike, and aren't happy about it. All of this was going on in the early 80s when Able Archer was underway. More information came out later. Turns out that the Russian automated systems detected a U.S. missile attack. Their systems are much more primitive than ours. Ours have satellite guidance, so basically you can see around the Earth. Theirs are eyesight, radar guided, so they get very brief warning. And of course there's much less sophisticated technically. So they detected a missile attack. The protocol is for that information to be transmitted to the High Command and the head of the government, Yeltsin at that time, and Andropov, and to at which point they would decide whether to launch a retaliatory attack or not. It had to pass through the hands of a particular person, Vladimir Petrov, Stanislav Petrov. He simply decided not to transmit the order. Otherwise, the clock would be at midnight. Now, that's happened before. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a point at which Kennedy had established a quarantine around Cuba. There were Russian submarines there, and they were under attack by U.S. destroyers, depth charges. The submarine commanders had no contact with the outside world. They assumed that a war had started, and they planned to launch their nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which probably would have set off a major nuclear war. In order to do so, 3 submarine commanders have to agree. 2 agreed, 1 refused. Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov and Petrov are responsible for our survival, among many others. There are studies in the United States. We don't have good records about Russia, but there have been some studies in the United States from declassified material of what the level of near accidents is. There was a major study in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists not long ago, studied available data on false alarms from 1977 to 1983, and it found between 43 and 255 per year. There's no reason to think that that's changing. In fact, if William Perry and others are correct, the threat's increasing. The author of this study, nuclear scientist Seth Baum, he writes that nuclear war is the black swan we can never see except in that brief moment when it's killing us. We delay eliminating the risk at our own peril. Now is the time to address the threat because now we are still alive. And tomorrow we might not be because these things are happening regularly and the threat is increasing. And there are known current cases. Read them in the newspaper. So a couple of weeks ago, a B-52, nuclear-capable B-52, by accident, flew near one of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea. Chinese weren't very happy about it. Fortunately, they didn't respond. We might ask how we'd respond if a Chinese nuclear-capable bomber, if they had any, they don't, was, say, flying over a Caribbean island. Well, they didn't react. Also, a couple of weeks ago, a U.S. F-16 military jet piloted by a Turkish pilot, part of the Turkish Air Force, but it's U.S. equipment, of course, shot down a Russian bomber. The bomber was bombing in Syria, and if you take a look at the map, there's a piece of Turkey that protrudes pretty deeply into Syria. And in the course of the bombing run, bombing ISIS, the Russian bomber passed across the tip of this protruding part of Turkey for 17 seconds and was shot down, landed in Syria towards which it was heading. The Russians did react. They didn't react by military force, but they reacted by bringing in high-level advanced anti-aircraft systems, much more advanced than had been there before, which blocks any further flight. They sent a missile cruiser in the Mediterranean towards Syria, building up their naval position there. Fortunately, it didn't lead to war. It could have. Not long after that, a Russian military jet in Eastern Europe came literally within seconds of hitting a Danish commercial airliner full of people in it. Again, we can imagine what the consequences of that might be. The major arms control journal, Arms Control Today, writes that both sides are practicing rapid mobilization and redeployment of forces to the Russia-NATO border, and both sides believe a war is no longer unthinkable. More collective insanity by the leadership on all sides. And worse than that, the record shows that the leaders just don't care. And furthermore, even scholarship doesn't seem to care. The cases, when you look at them, are just mind-boggling. So go back to the beginning of the Cold War, around 1950. The United States had astonishing security. It had half the world's wealth. It totally controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. And it had military force that was incomparable. There'd never been such security and power in the world's history. But there was one potential threat, and it was understood that it might happen. The potential threat was ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, with hydrogen bomb warheads. They didn't exist, but they were in the process of development, and they would exist. And that would be a threat, not only a threat, but a threat of total destruction to the United States. Well, there is a standard scholarly history of the nuclear arms race, written by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former Harvard dean. And he was given access to the highest level documents, internal documents. And in the course of his long history, he has a paragraph in which he discusses this. He points out that he mentions that he was not able to find any discussion whatsoever, even a kind of a staff paper that wasn't submitted, which raised the question whether it might be worthwhile to do something to try to prevent the one lethal threat to the United States, a treaty with the Russians to ban the development of these weapons. Apparently nobody even thought of it, paid any thought of the idea, just who cares? You know, he didn't care either, he just went on to the next sentence. And scholarship apparently doesn't care either, since you can search, almost nobody ever refers to it. And would it have been possible? It's very likely. The Russians were way behind technologically and knew it. They were making peace feelers. There was even an offer from Stalin to allow Germany to be unified, which is a major threat to Russia, and have a free election, monitored free election, in which the communists would surely lose, with one condition, that it not join NATO, hostile military alliance. Very sensible condition if you think about the history of the preceding half century, when Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times. It was simply disregarded, dismissed. Now it's recognized by scholarship that it was probably serious, and there were other such efforts, but nobody cared. And it goes on like that. If you take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, historian Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's close advisor, describes it as the most dangerous moment in history. You take a look at we know tremendous details about it, because all the documents have been released and declassified. And if you read through them, it's just shocking. At the peak moment of the crisis, October 27th, 1962, there was an offer from the Russians, from Khrushchev, to end the crisis completely by their withdrawing missiles from Cuba and the United States withdrawing missiles from Turkey, Jupiter missiles, which were obsolete and were under a withdrawal order because they were being replaced by much more destructive Polaris submarines. So that was the offer. Kennedy thought about it and rejected it. He even, just think, at that point, his own estimate, subjective estimate, was that there was a 1/3 to a half possibility of a nuclear war, which means a terminal war. It's finished. Major nuclear war leaves essentially nothing. So with that assumption, he was willing to turn down an offer to withdraw obsolete missiles from Turkey, which are being replaced by more lethal ones, in return for ending the crisis. He was willing to do something secretly, but not publicly. It was necessary to humiliate the Russians and show how macho he was. And worse yet, this is praised by scholarship as cool courage under pressure and so on. We're supposed to admire it. 10 years later, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, called a high-level nuclear alert, 1973. The reason, as he explained, it's not secret, was to scare the Russians away. This was during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. Russia and the United States had agreed to impose a ceasefire, but secretly Kissinger had informed Israel that they didn't have to abide by it. The U.S. wouldn't react if they went ahead and destroyed an Egyptian army. And there was a concern that Russia might interfere with what's called delicate diplomacy. So Kissinger called a nuclear alert to warn them to stay away. Fortunately, they did. We survived. 10 years after that comes Reagan's explorations of the Russian defenses, which I already talked about. The point is, this goes on constantly. And it's highly provocative, adventurous actions taken without much concern for whether the population will survive. When governments talk about security, they don't mean security for populations. They mean for state power, for the private power interests that the government supports. That's constant, quite apart from the regular accidents. So you can see why the clock is set at 3 minutes to midnight, and you can see why we right now have to make decisions that will determine the prospects for survival. And there are plenty of other major issues. So you may have seen a report that Oxfam produced every year. Oxfam does a major study on inequality. In 2014, they found that about 90 individuals in the world have half the world's wealth. This year, 2015, turns out that 62 individuals in the world have half the world's wealth. 62 people have what the bottom 3.5 billion have. And that's increasing. It's a disaster, part of the disaster of the neoliberal policies that have been pursued for the past generation. Been a disaster everywhere. Has its own form here, another one in Europe, and its worldwide impact is illustrated by these results. In addition to that, there's a huge refugee crisis. As I already mentioned, the number of people fleeing from their homes is beyond anything in recorded history and increasing. And it's a terrible burden for the rich countries. So in Europe, for example, there's only one country, Germany, that's done something to take in refugees. It's now retreating, and it's considered a huge crisis. And Germany's a rich country of over 80 million people, and they're threatened by disaster because they might take in 1 million refugees. Take in contrast Lebanon, a poor country with serious crises internally. About a quarter of the population is Syrian refugees, in addition to other refugees that have fled from the establishment of Israel in 1948 and later actions. But they're somehow managing. Similarly, Jordan. Turkey has over 2 million refugees. In fact, and where are these refugees coming from? I mean, they're coming to a substantial extent as a result of actions that the West has carried out. The U.S. bombing of attack on Iraq, invasion of Iraq, the worst crime of this century, surely, created maybe 2 million refugees who were, as well as destroying the country and inciting an ethnic and sectarian conflict which is tearing the country and the region apart, out of which grew the ISIS monstrosity. Iraq, incidentally, is now ranked as the unhappiest country in the world in world studies of happiness. But millions of hundreds of thousands, probably millions of refugees fled, and they were admitted, not to the United States, to poor countries, to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, before it imploded, Iran. They take the refugees in, we generate them, then we have a crisis. Same with the United States and the areas to the south. You may have seen a dramatic story in the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago about a man who lived here, who had been here for 25 years, undocumented, had a family, a job, children, business, but he had fled from Guatemala. What was he fleeing from? He was fleeing from the areas that had been devastated by a virtually genocidal war in the early 80s in the highlands, which was supported by the Reagan administration. And there are plenty of them around here, incidentally. People, and it's others, the plurality of refugees in the last couple of years was coming from Honduras. Why Honduras? Because in 2000, which was always a very poor country, in 2009, the president of Honduras, President Zelaya, began to institute some very mildly reformist actions. So he was immediately overthrown by a military coup. The United States refused to call it a coup, although it plainly was, because if it had been called a coup, we would have had to stop sending the military aid, and the Obama administration wanted to keep the military aid going. So we didn't do that. Then came an election which practically nobody in the world paid attention to, but the United States legitimized it, and that sank all of this, set off a period of murder, destruction in Honduras, even way beyond what it was for a couple of years. It was the murder capital of the world. People are fleeing. Women, children, others are fleeing. But we have a crisis because they're fleeing here. Europe and the United States are reacting to these crises, so-called, in similar ways. Europe is trying to essentially bribe Turkey into keeping the refugees there. Now it's pressuring Greece to block them. In fact, just the last couple of days, the European Union has called for setting up camps, what amount to concentration camps in Greece, to house the refugees there. Meanwhile, Greece itself is being devastated by savage austerity policies imposed by the so-called Troika, the Brussels bureaucrats. But they have to take in the refugees in camps and keep them out in the sea. Europe is now planning naval patrols and others to keep the refugees away. We don't want them. And we're doing the same thing. And we're pressuring Mexico to keep the refugees away from our border. So we smash up and destroy Central America, and then when people flee, keep them away from us. And if you really go to the extremes, Donald Trump, build a wall, get Mexico to pay for the wall, keep them away from us. Now, there's an interesting comment on all of this years ago, not about this, but it applies, by Winston Churchill. He wrote back in the early 40s and earlier that the government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations who wish nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. But none of us had any reason to seek for anything more. The peace would be kept by peoples who lived in their own way and were not ambitious. Our power placed us above the rest. We were like rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations. We are not a young people, he's talking to the British cabinet. We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, and our claim to be left in unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us. But we're rich men living in peace within our habitations, and we don't be bothered. You poor countries, you pick up the wreckage and the treatise of our atrocities around the world. Now we have to ask the question whether that's who we are. Is Churchill right? Is that who we are? Today, as I said, the New York Times repeats the general celebration that the United States has gone from fears of oil and gas shortages to becoming the world's leading producer of both fuels. Both Russia and the United States are preparing for war and regard it as thinkable. And if that's who we are, our grandchildren and others like them throughout the world are in very deep trouble.